There comes a point in every empath's life when they stop rescuing people who refuse to swim. You see, the super empath has spent so much time understanding, healing, and forgiving the avoidant, the one who pulls away, who fears closeness, who runs when things get real. For so long, the empath has been the emotional anchor, holding steady while the other person drifts in and out, deciding when connection feels safe enough to touch and when it's time to retreat. But something shifts. One day, the empath doesn't chase anymore. They stop trying to explain, stop proving their worth, stop overextending to earn affection that should have been freely given. They realize that love doesn't mean constant emotional labor. Love doesn't mean waiting for someone who keeps their heart on a leash. When the empath finally detaches, it's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's silent, terrifyingly calm. They don't send angry messages. They don't beg for closure, they simply withdraw the energy that used to feed the connection, and that's when it hits the avoidant hard, because for the first time, the avoidant feels the silence they created. The empath's presence, once a constant source of validation and comfort, is gone. That gentle understanding they took for granted becomes a void, and the avoidant, who thought detachment was their strength, realizes they were only comfortable because someone else kept showing up. You see, detachment isn't cruelty, it's clarity. When the empath detaches, they're not punishing anyone, they're honoring themselves. They finally understand that emotional availability isn't something you can force out of someone. It has to be chosen. And here's the beautiful irony: the very moment the empath stops trying to fix the relationship is when their power returns. They begin to thrive. Their focus shifts inward, and they start nurturing the parts of themselves that had been neglected in the name of love. They laugh again, they glow differently, they breathe deeper because emotional freedom feels like peace. Meanwhile, the avoidant begins to feel something new: loss. Not because they suddenly learn to love differently overnight, but because they no longer have the emotional safety net they once depended on. They realize that the empath wasn't needy, they were nurturing. They weren't clingy, they were consistent, and consistency is rare. So when the empath detaches, it isn't just a breakup, it's a shift in emotional power. It's the universe saying, you've learned your lesson. The empath no longer seeks validation from those who fear connection. They've learned that real love doesn't require you to lose yourself to keep someone else. And that, right there, is the quiet strength of a super empath. They love deeply, but they can also let go gracefully. Because when your love comes from a place of wholeness, walking away isn't weakness, it's wisdom. A super empath's detachment doesn't come from anger or resentment. It comes from a quiet understanding that not everyone is ready to meet them at the level of emotional depth they offer. For so long, the empath has been the one holding space for others, listening, caring, absorbing, and nurturing, often without receiving the same energy in return. They've spent countless moments trying to decode the silence of the avoidant, trying to soften the sharp edges of emotional distance, and believing that if they just loved harder, the other person would finally feel safe enough to stay. But what they come to understand, slowly and painfully, is that love cannot grow where fear controls the soil. No matter how patient or gentle they are, they cannot heal someone who refuses to face their own wounds. Detachment begins the day the empath realizes that their compassion has turned into self-abandonment. They see how they've been bending themselves into shapes to accommodate someone else's avoidance, walking on emotional eggshells just to keep the peace. That moment of realization doesn't erupt in chaos, it arrives quietly, like a deep breath after holding it for too long. The empath starts to see the truth. They were never too emotional, too sensitive, or too intense. They were simply trying to love someone who wasn't ready to be loved in that way. This clarity changes everything. The super empath no longer feels the need to explain their worth or convince the avoidant that they deserve to be seen. They stop replaying conversations in their mind, searching for what they did wrong. Instead, they shift the focus back inward, asking themselves why they tolerated inconsistency, why they equated pain with passion, and why they believed love meant waiting for someone to choose them. It's in this reflection that the detachment truly takes root. It's not a wall built out of bitterness, but a boundary made of wisdom. Once this awareness settles, the empath's energy begins to change. They no longer chase reassurance or overextend themselves to maintain connection. The emotional knots start to loosen, and what once felt like heartbreak begins to feel like freedom. The avoidant, who once felt control through their distance, can sense the shift even if it's never spoken aloud. The empath's tone becomes calmer, their response is shorter, their presence less predictable, and that subtle withdrawal, that graceful, grounded detachment is more powerful than any confrontation. What the empath has discovered is self-preservation dressed in compassion. They still care, but they now understand that love should never come at the cost of self-respect. They've learned that empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction, and that emotional availability is only meaningful when it's mutual. This is the moment when their heart, once wide open to the pain of others, turns its warmth back toward itself. They start pouring the same love they once gave freely to the avoidant into their own healing, and in doing so, they reclaim their power. Their detachment, then, isn't a rejection of love, it's a return to it, but this time the love is directed inward. The silence of a super empath carries a power that words could never match. When they finally stop explaining, defending, or trying to make someone understand how deeply they feel, that quiet becomes deafening. It's not the silence of defeat, it's the silence of realization. For so long, the empath has been the voice of connection, the one initiating conversations, soothing tensions, and creating emotional safety. They have spent countless moments trying to bridge the distance that the avoidant creates, believing that if they just keep showing up, love will eventually feel safe for both of them. But when the empath finally grows tired of being the only one holding the emotional rope, they loosen their grip and everything changes. That silence isn't passive, it's intentional. It's the empath reclaiming their voice by choosing not to use it. It's the end of over-explaining their feelings to someone who never truly listens. The end of defending their needs to someone who treats vulnerability as a weakness. The silence speaks louder than any confrontation because it says, "I've said all that needed to be said. Now I'm watching what you do." And when the avoidant realizes that the constant flow of empathy, warmth, and reassurance has stopped, they begin to feel the weight of the absence they created. For the empath, this silence is not an act of manipulation, it's an act of self-preservation. It's the moment they stop giving their emotional energy away so freely and start using it to rebuild themselves. They no longer chase after half-hearted replies or settle for emotionally unavailable gestures disguised as affection. Instead, they sit in their own peace, learning that stillness can be healing. Their quiet becomes a sacred space where they can finally hear their own thoughts without the noise of another person's confusion. This is where the transformation deepens. The empath begins to realize that their energy has always been powerful. It could calm storms, soften hearts, and heal pain. But now, instead of using that energy to fix someone else, they use it to fortify themselves. Their boundaries, once blurred by empathy, begin to sharpen. They no longer feel guilty for stepping back or protecting their peace. And that internal shift radiates outward. They move differently, speak differently, and carry a quiet confidence that doesn't seek validation anymore. To the avoidant, this change is startling. They were accustomed to the empath's availability, to the comfort of knowing someone cared deeply even when they couldn't reciprocate it fully. When that energy disappears, the void feels uncomfortable, even haunting. They begin to realize that the empath's emotional presence wasn't something to be taken lightly. It was the heartbeat of the connection. The silence, therefore, becomes the mirror in which the avoidant must finally face themselves. The empath's calm withdrawal says everything that words could never express. It's not about punishing the other person, it's about respecting their own emotional limits. The quiet becomes a boundary, a declaration that they will no longer overextend themselves to be understood. In that stillness, the empath doesn't lose power, they embody it, and for perhaps the first time, their peace speaks louder than their pain. When the empath finally detaches, something profound happens. The avoidant is left to face the emptiness they've been running from all along. For so long, the avoidant felt secure knowing the empath would always be there, patiently waiting for them to return after every emotional withdrawal. The empath's presence provided a sense of stability even when the avoidant claimed to need space. Deep down, the avoidant relied on that unconditional warmth as a silent reassurance that they were cared for, even when they didn't have the courage to show care in return. But when the empath finally walks away, that safety net disappears. Suddenly, the avoidant's silence feels heavy instead of peaceful, and their independence starts to resemble isolation. The avoidant has often mistaken control for comfort. By keeping emotional distance, they believed they were protecting themselves from vulnerability and rejection. What they didn't realize was that the empath's consistent love was cushioning them from the loneliness they were avoiding. The empath's patience made it easy for them to believe they could come and go without consequence. But when that emotional foundation crumbles, when the empath stops reaching out, stops soothing, stops forgiving, the avoidant is confronted with the void their fear has created. It's not punishment, it's reality reflecting back at them. In this space of absence, the avoidant begins to feel the loss not just of a person, but of emotional grounding. The empath's love, once seen as overwhelming or too much, now reveals itself as something rare, genuine connection. The avoidant starts to remember the small moments, the messages that checked in without pressure, the conversations that offered understanding instead of judgment, the unconditional support that never demanded perfection. They begin to see how the empath's emotional availability was never weakness, but strength, the kind of strength that made them feel safe enough to let their guard down, even if only for fleeting moments. For the first time, the avoidant is left to sit with their discomfort. There's no one left to absorb their coldness or soften their withdrawal. The silence, which once felt like protection, now echoes with regret. This is the emotional reckoning the empath never intended but often triggers simply by walking away. The avoidant realizes that while they were guarding their heart, the empath was offering theirs without conditions, and that kind of love doesn't come around easily. Meanwhile, the empath has already begun to rebuild. They're healing in the peace that follows detachment, rediscovering their sense of worth beyond the relationship. They no longer define love as endurance, they define it as balance. The avoidant, on the other hand, begins to understand that emotional distance isn't strength when it leaves you empty. The very behavior they thought protected them has become the reason for their loneliness. This is when the realization hits hardest. The empath's consistency was never dependency, it was devotion. The avoidant learns, often too late, that the person who stayed through their silence was the one who truly saw them. And when that presence is gone, they come face to face with the truth. It wasn't the empath who was too much. It was their own fear that made them give too little. True emotional detachment isn't born out of revenge or resentment. It emerges from a deep understanding that peace is far more valuable than the endless chase for validation. For a super empath, the journey toward detachment begins after countless attempts to hold together a connection that constantly slips through their fingers. They have loved from a place of sincerity, given without limits, and extended compassion even when it wasn't reciprocated. But eventually, the exhaustion of emotional imbalance takes its toll. The empath realizes that trying to earn love from someone afraid of closeness is like pouring water into a broken cup. No matter how much they give, it will never be enough. When the empath reaches this realization, they stop trying to prove their worth through effort. They stop interpreting every cold reaction as a challenge to love harder. Instead, they begin to see that peace doesn't come from changing someone else, it comes from choosing themselves. That choice is quiet but transformative. It's the moment they decide that walking away from confusion is healthier than staying in chaos. The need for explanation fades because they no longer seek permission to honor their emotions. This form of detachment is misunderstood by many, especially by the avoidant. The avoidant might perceive the empath's withdrawal as indifference or emotional punishment, but in truth, it's liberation. The empath no longer wishes to fight battles that drain their soul. They understand that love should never feel like constant survival, so they stop reaching out to fix what keeps breaking, and they stop hoping that distance will somehow teach the avoidant how to love differently. They begin to see that the peace they were seeking from the relationship was something they had the power to create within themselves all along. As the empath detaches, their inner world becomes lighter. They no longer carry the emotional weight of someone else's fears or the burden of trying to earn reciprocity. The silence they once feared now feels soothing. It's no longer empty but full of self-respect. The constant analysis of what went wrong is replaced with gratitude for what was learned. This is not the cold kind of detachment that shuts the heart down. It's a warm, conscious release that allows both people to face themselves honestly. For the avoidant, this calm departure often feels more painful than any confrontation. They are used to emotional reactions to people pleading, explaining, or chasing. But when the empath detaches with serenity instead of anger, it disarms the avoidant completely. There's no fight to engage in, no drama to deflect, just silence, peaceful, unwavering silence, and within that stillness, the avoidant must finally confront what the empath had been trying to show all along. Love cannot exist without presence, and connection cannot survive without vulnerability. The empath's peace becomes their power. Their detachment is not an escape but a declaration that they will no longer sacrifice their emotional well-being to sustain someone else's comfort. In choosing peace, they teach a powerful truth that sometimes the bravest thing love can do is walk away quietly and never look back. The greatest power of a super empath lies in their ability to love deeply and still walk away gracefully when that love is no longer returned. For much of their lives, empaths believe that loving deeply means staying no matter what. That endurance is proof of devotion. They pour themselves into others, offering understanding, forgiveness, and unwavering loyalty even when the relationship becomes one-sided. But with time and self-awareness, they begin to learn that love without reciprocity becomes self-sacrifice, and staying in spaces where they are unseen only diminishes their light. This realization doesn't come easily. It comes through pain, reflection, and a quiet breaking open of the heart. The empath's love is never shallow. When they connect with someone, they see beyond the surface. They feel potential, wounds, and depth. That's why walking away is so difficult for them. They're not just leaving a person, they're letting go of what they believed that person could become. Yet this is where their strength truly shines. Despite the attachment, despite the memories, despite the hope that things could change, they still find the courage to release what no longer grows with them. They understand that holding on to something that drains them isn't love, it's fear disguised as loyalty. Walking away gracefully doesn't mean they've stopped caring, it means they've started caring about themselves too. They no longer confuse self-abandonment with love or silence with peace. The grace with which they leave is rooted in acceptance and understanding that sometimes love can exist without being enough to keep two people together. They stop fighting for potential and start protecting their peace. There are no harsh words, no scenes of resentment, just a quiet withdrawal that speaks of maturity and self-respect. The empath's departure is gentle but final, and it comes with an energy that says, I love you, but I love me more. This graceful exit often has a profound effect on the avoidant. They expect anger, accusations, or pleading, but instead they're met with calm detachment, something they can't control or push away. The empath's composure unsettles them because it reflects a kind of emotional mastery they don't yet possess. It's the moment when the avoidant realizes that the empath's love was not a weakness, but a gift one they mishandled. And when the empath walks away with peace instead of pain, it leaves an imprint that no other connection can replicate. For the empath, this act of letting go is not just about leaving a relationship, it's a spiritual transformation. They learn that love does not demand self-destruction, and that boundaries do not make them cold, they make them whole. Their ability to detach with grace shows that love and self-respect can coexist, that one can hold compassion for another while choosing not to lose themselves in the process. This balance of heart and strength, softness and power, is what makes the super empath extraordinary. They love with purity, they let go with wisdom, and in doing so, they remind the world that true love never diminishes the self, it honors it. In the end, the journey of a super empath is one of strength disguised as softness, a reminder that true power lies not in how long we hold on, but in how gracefully we let go. When love becomes one-sided, detachment is not cruelty but courage, and choosing peace over chaos is the highest form of self-respect. The empath's story is not about loss. It's about reclaiming emotional freedom and rediscovering wholeness within. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for remembering that real love begins the moment we decide to honor ourselves first.